Good evening and welcome to Edward's Sleep Mysteries. I'm Edward and I'll be keeping you company as the day quietly loosens its hold. I've learnt that sleep doesn't arrive on command. It wanders in when the mind feels safe enough to rest. If you like, let me know in the comments whether you stay with the story until its final words or simply until sleep gently claims you. You're warmly invited to subscribe if these quiet mysteries have become part of your evenings. Now, settle back and allow the mystery to fade softly into dreams. Chapter 1. Morning Bells and Lowered Voices. There are towns in England, dear reader, which seem to have been fashioned by Providence herself as repositories of that particular species of quietness which belongs neither to solitude nor to silence, but rather to the soft murmur of lives lived in such close proximity that every joy and sorrow becomes, in time, a shared inheritance. Cranley Hollow was such a town, nestled as it was in a gentle fold of the Kentish countryside, where the church spire rose modestly above the rooftops like a finger pointing heavenward with more hope than insistence, and where the lanes wound between cottages of grey stone and brick, with that pleasing irregularity which suggests organic growth rather than deliberate planning. On this particular Christmas morning in the year of our Lord 1847, the bells of St. Edmund's rang out across the frost-touched roofs and gardens with their customary cheerfulness, yet there was observable to those possessed of keen perception a certain restraint in the conversations which followed their melodious summons. The greetings exchanged between neighbours as they emerged from their dwellings, wrapped against the December chill in woolen scarves and well-worn greatcoats, possessed a quality of carefulness, as though each word were being weighed before release, like coins counted out upon a counter. It was not that Cranley Hollow had ever been remarkable for boisterous celebration. The town's character, shaped by generations of agricultural labour and modest trade, inclined naturally towards contentment rather than exuberance, towards steady fellowship rather than passionate demonstration. Yet there had always been, particularly upon Christmas Day, a warmth of manner, an openness of countenance which transformed the ordinary courtesies of daily life into something approaching genuine festivity. This year, however, that transformation seemed somehow arrested, as though the town had taken a collective breath and not yet decided whether to release it in laughter or in sigh. Mr. Thomas Everard, assistant to the postmaster and a figure so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the town's daily operations that he was noticed chiefly in his absence, made his way along the high street with his characteristic measured tread. He was a man a bit of perhaps 35 years, though his face bore that quality of agelessness which comes to those whose lives have been passed in the performance of duties rather than the pursuit of passions. His features were regular without being handsome, pleasant without being memorable, and his dress spoke of that careful economy which maintains respectability without aspiring to distinction. His coat was well brushed, his boots well kept, and his manner toward all he encountered was marked by a courtesy so consistent as to have become almost invisible, like the air one breathes without remarking upon it. Yet this morning even Mr. Everard's usually placid demeanour seemed touched by an awareness of something indefinably altered in the town's atmosphere. As he passed Mrs. Winifred Cole, who stood upon her doorstep with a basket of holly intended for the church decoration, his greeting was perhaps a shade more solicitous than usual, and her response carried a flutter of that nervous garrulousness which sometimes overtakes persons who wish to appear entirely at ease while feeling precisely the opposite. Mrs. Cole was a woman of substantial build and substantial opinions, both of which she bore with an air of benevolent authority. She had long considered it her particular province to know the circumstances of every family in Cranley Hollow, a knowledge she had acquired not through vulgar curiosity, she would have insisted, but through a genuine concern for the welfare of her neighbours. That this concern expressed itself primarily through the collection and dissemination of information about said neighbours was a fact which never troubled her conscience, for she held firmly to the belief that knowledge, even of the most particular and personal sort, was best kept in circulation rather than allowed to stagnate in private keeping. This morning, however, Mrs. Cole's usual volubility seemed channeled into observations of remarkable triviality. She spoke at length about the quality of the frost, the probable duration of the cold, the excellence of the hollyberries this year, and the peculiar behaviour of her sister's cat, all the while avoiding, with an assiduousness that was itself remarkable, any mention of the matter which clearly occupied her thoughts. The Reverend Nicholas Hale emerged from the vicarage as Mr. Everard continued his progress toward the post office, where certain holiday duties required his attention even upon this sacred day. The Reverend was a man of gentle aspect and reflective temperament, more inclined to contemplation than to pronouncement, and more comfortable with questions than with answers. His sermons were noted for their brevity and their tendency to conclude with encouragements toward kindness rather than warnings against wickedness, an approach which endeared him to his congregation, while occasionally leaving them uncertain as to what precisely they ought to do about any particular moral difficulty. He raised his hand in greeting to Mr. Everard, and the two men exchanged words whose content was entirely conventional yet whose undertone suggested depths unplumbed. There was in their brief conversation that quality of significant insignificance which marks discourse between persons who are conscious of sharing knowledge that must not be directly acknowledged. Indeed, throughout Cranley Hollow that morning similar exchanges occurred with remarkable frequency. Greetings were extended with particular warmth, as though to compensate for some deficit of substance. Inquiries after health and happiness were made with unusual earnestness, and yet, beneath this intensification of ordinary civility, there ran a current of reserve, a holding back as though the town had collectively decided that certain subjects were, for the present at least, best left unmentioned. The cause of this peculiar atmosphere, had one possessed sufficient boldness to inquire directly, might have been traced to a small sealed envelope which had made its way through channels both mysterious and deliberate into the hands of several of Cranley Hollow's most prominent residents during the hours preceding dawn. The note contained within this envelope had been brief, its message neither threatening nor accusatory in tone, yet its effect upon those who read it had been profound, for it had touched upon matters which the town had long ago agreed, through that silent consensus which requires no formal discussion, were best left undisturbed. What precisely the note contained, and from whom it had come, were questions which hung unspoken in the air of Cranley Hollow that Christmas morning, as palpable as the smoke rising from 100 chimneys, as present as the frost upon the ground, and as carefully unacknowledged as any truth which threatens to disturb a peace that has been purchased, perhaps, at too high a cost. Chapter 10. When the town remembered how to speak. The weeks which followed that Christmas day brought to Cranley Hollow changes both subtle and significant, alterations in the texture of daily life, which might have passed unnoticed by a casual observer, but which marked, for those who dwelt within the town's ancient boundaries, a shift in the very atmosphere they breathed. It was as though a weight which had long pressed upon the community without being consciously acknowledged had been lifted, allowing people to move with greater freedom, to speak with less constraint, and to meet one another's gazes without the faint shadow of unease which had haunted their interactions whenever certain subjects drew near to conversation. The charitable fund which had been proposed during that meeting at the vicarage came into being with a swiftness which surprised even those who had advocated most strongly for its creation. Mr. Hayes, perhaps seeking to demonstrate through action what words could not adequately express, contributed to sums considerably larger than duty required, and did so with a quietness which suggested genuine desire to make amends rather than to purchase absolution through public display. Miss Brown devoted herself to the fund's administration with an energy which, while perhaps tinged with penitence, nonetheless resulted in a system notably more responsive and considerably less encumbered by procedural obstacles than the charitable apparatus which had preceded it. Mrs. Cole, in a development which occasioned some gentle amazement among those who knew her well, became an advocate for families new to Cranley Hollow, making it her particular business to ensure that newcomers were introduced to the proper persons, informed of available resources, and generally made to feel that their unfamiliarity with local customs did not diminish their claim to neighbourly consideration. She performed this work with a thoroughness which might have seemed officious, had it not been accompanied by a genuine warmth quite different from the condescending benevolence which had characterised her earlier charitable efforts. The memorial which had been discussed took form as a simple bench placed in the churchyard, bearing an inscription which read, "In memory of those who passed through Cranley Hollow, seeking home and found hardship, may we prove more generous than we have been." It was not a grand monument, nor was it intended to be, but it served its purpose, which was to ensure that the town could not walk past St. Edmund's without being reminded of obligations which extended beyond the comfortable circle of long-established residents to embrace all souls who might, through circumstances beyond their control, require the assistance which any truly Christian community ought to be prepared to offer. Reverend Hale's sermons, in the months that followed, acquired a directness which some of his older parishioners found initially disconcerting, but which most came to appreciate as refreshing. He spoke less of abstract virtues and more of specific duties, less of spiritual comfort and more of practical compassion. His congregation, rather than diminishing in response to these altered emphases, grew both in numbers and in engagement, as though people had been waiting for permission to discuss openly the very matters they had long confined to whispered speculation. Mr. Topombe. Thomas Everard continued in his position at the post office, conducting his duties with the same quiet efficiency which had always characterised his work. Yet those who knew him well, and there were more who could claim such knowledge now than there had been before that Christmas day, observed certain changes in his bearing. He seemed perhaps less solitary, less defined entirely by the routines of his employment. He was seen more often in conversation with various townspeople, not conducting official business, but simply engaging in that easy fellowship which marks genuine community rather than mere proximity. He had received some weeks after Christmas a letter postmarked from a town some considerable distance to the north. It had been addressed in a hand which suggested education overcome through determination rather than received through privilege, and it had been signed with a name he had expected: Sarah Carow, eldest daughter of Thomas and Mary, now a young woman of 23 years employed as a governess in a respectable household. The letter had thanked him for remembering, though she did not specify what exactly he had remembered, trusting that he would understand. It had expressed neither bitterness nor demand for further redress, but simply a quiet satisfaction that her family's experience had not been entirely forgotten, that their suffering had been acknowledged, and that perhaps some good might come from the town's belated recognition of how it had failed them. She wrote that her father had died some 3 years past, his injury never having properly healed. Her mother lived still in reduced circumstances, but with dignity maintained through her own labour and the assistance of her children, all of whom had grown to adulthood and found employment despite the disadvantages their difficult childhood had imposed. Sarah Carow did not ask whether the town felt shame or sought forgiveness. She asked only that Cranley Hollow remember them accurately, not as unfortunate souls who had simply moved on to better fortune, but as a family who had needed help and been denied it, when that help might have made all the difference between hardship and catastrophe. If the town could learn from that failure, she wrote, then perhaps her father's suffering and her family's exile might serve some purpose beyond their own pain. Mr. Everard had read this letter multiple times, finding in its careful words a grace which humbled him. He had shared its contents, with Miss Carrow's permission, sought through subsequent correspondence with those who had gathered at the vicarage that day after Christmas. It had been this letter, more than any sermon or resolution or charitable initiative, which had truly completed the work which the anonymous note had begun. For it had revealed that the Carrows, despite every reason to harbour resentment, had chosen instead to offer the town an opportunity for redemption. They had not sought revenge but recognition, not punishment but acknowledgement, and in so doing they had demonstrated a charity which put to shame the town's earlier failures in that virtue. The seasons turned, as seasons will, and Cranley Hollow moved forward into spring and summer with its usual rhythms, but there remained, woven into the fabric of daily life, an awareness which had not existed before. When new families arrived in the town, they were received differently, When misfortune struck households without deep roots or extensive connections, assistance came more swiftly and with fewer conditions. When the charitable fund was applied, it was applied with trust rather than suspicion, with urgency rather than delay. Not every interaction embodied perfect charity. Not every decision reflected complete wisdom. The town remained what it had always been, a community of imperfect people struggling to live according to principles which exceeded their consistent grasp. But there was nonetheless a difference. The whispers which had once served to avoid difficult truths now carried, more often than not, genuine concern rather than anxious evasion. The silences which had once marked subjects too uncomfortable to address now occurred less frequently, replaced by conversations which, while sometimes difficult, were at least honest. Mr. Everard, walking the familiar lanes on a spring morning with the post under his arm, reflected that this was perhaps the most which could be hoped for from any community. Not perfection, but improvement, not the elimination of failure, but the willingness to learn from failure. Not the absence of wrongdoing, but the courage to acknowledge wrongdoing and to resolve with genuine intention to do better. The town had remembered how to not in grand pronouncements or dramatic declarations, but in the small daily exchanges which constitute genuine fellowship. It had learned that charity begins not with the comfortable distribution of surplus resources, but with the uncomfortable recognition that comfort itself may need to be sacrificed when necessity demands. And it had discovered that the greatest gift the past can offer the present is not the comfortable reassurance that all was done which could be done, but the honest acknowledgement that more could have been done, and the determination to ensure that such opportunities, when they arise again, will not be similarly squandered. As for the Carrow family, they remained where they were, living their lives in circumstances which Cranley Hollow could no longer influence. But they were remembered now, remembered accurately, remembered with respect and with regret, and remembered in such fashion that their experience might serve to guide the town toward better choices in future. This, perhaps, was all they had sought, and it was certainly all that could now be offered. The mystery which had troubled Cranley Hollow that Christmas Day had been resolved not through dramatic revelation, but through patient acknowledgement, not through accusation, but through confession, not through punishment, but through repentance. And the town, having passed through whispers to arrive at speech, settled into a new rhythm, which was neither perfectly harmonious nor entirely discordant, but rather marked by that quality of honest endeavour which characterises communities willing to face their failures and to learn from them. The bells of St. Edmund's continued to ring out over the rooftops, calling the faithful to worship and marking the passage of hours with their ancient music. But they rang now over a town which had learned through trial and through grace that Christmas's true meaning lies not in festive celebration alone, but in that harder and more essential work of extending mercy to those who have no claim upon us save their simple humanity, and of remembering with clarity and with kindness both our virtues and our failings, that we might grow more charitable through honest reckoning than we could ever become through comfortable forgetting. Chapter 9. A Truth Shared Without Urgency. The day following Christmas possessed that peculiar character which marks the transition between festival and ordinary time, when decorations remained in place but their festivity seemed somehow diminished, when the routines of daily life reasserted themselves but had not yet fully resumed their customary rhythm. In Cranley Hollow, where the events of Christmas Day had left an impression more lasting than the usual seasonal sentiments, this transitional period took on additional significance, as though the town itself were pausing to consider what direction its steps should take now that certain truths could no longer be comfortably ignored. It was on this day, in the quiet hours of late morning, when most households were engaged in the comfortable disorder which follows celebration, that Mr. Everard found himself once again at the vicarage, this time accompanied by Mrs. Cole and Miss Brown. The gathering had been arranged through the quietest of channels, a few words exchanged after the previous evening's service, a shared understanding that certain conversations could no longer be postponed, and that such conversations required participants willing to speak honestly rather than strategically. Reverend Hale received them in his study, that book-lined sanctuary which had witnessed countless pastoral conversations over the years. He had arranged chairs in a configuration which suggested equality rather than hierarchy, which invited dialogue rather than pronouncement. Tea was provided, not with the formality which marks occasions of state, but with the simple hospitality which acknowledges shared humanity before addressing shared concerns. For several minutes no one spoke of the matter which had brought them together. Mrs. Cole remarked upon the mildness of the weather for late December. Miss Brown observed that the church decorations had been particularly lovely this year. Reverend Hale inquired after Mr. Everard's health and mentioned a small matter of postal business which might require attention in the coming week. These preliminaries, while seemingly trivial, served an essential purpose, establishing a tone of civility and mutual regard which would make possible the more difficult exchanges to follow. It was Mr. Everard who at length introduced the subject which occupied all their thoughts. He did so not dramatically, not with accusation or demand, but simply by stating what they all knew to be true. The Carrow family had come to Cranley Hollow seeking opportunity and safety. They had met with misfortune which was not of their making. They had needed help which the town had been capable of providing but had chosen, through a combination of procedural delay and social prejudice, to withhold. And they had departed, not to better circumstances as the town had preferred to believe, but to uncertain fate in some other place where they might hope, though not expect, to be received more generously than they had been here. These facts, Mr. Everard suggested, were not in dispute. What remained to be determined was what response these facts should prompt now, years after the events themselves, when the Carrows were gone and the opportunity to help them directly had passed beyond recovery. Mrs. Cole, who had entered the vicarage with shoulders squared as though prepared for battle, found herself disarmed by this straightforward recitation. She had expected accusations, had prepared defences, had been ready to argue about circumstances and limitations and the impossibility of helping everyone in need. But Mr. Everard's calm acknowledgement of what had happened, without apparent interest in assigning blame or demanding apology, left her uncertain how to proceed. After a long moment of silence she spoke, and her voice carried less of its usual certainty than those who knew her might have expected. She confessed, with visible difficulty, that she had influenced opinion against the Carrows in ways she had told herself were merely prudent, but which, as she now recognised, had been rooted less in genuine concern about proper use of resources than in a discomfort with people who had not yet earned, in her estimation, the right to make claims upon the community's charity. She had not meant to be cruel, she had not intended harm, but she had allowed her preference for the familiar to override her duty toward those in need, regardless of whether those in need belonged to families she had known since childhood or to families barely known at all. Miss Brown, encouraged perhaps by Mrs. Cole's unexpected candour, added her own acknowledgement. She had hidden behind procedures, she said, behind forms and committees and proper channels, because these had provided protection against the discomfort of acting swiftly and decisively. She had told herself that haste made waste, that charity required careful oversight, that rushing to help might create dependencies, or set precedents which would prove unsustainable. But in truth she now believed she had been afraid of the vulnerability which comes with genuine charity, afraid of giving without guarantee of worthiness, afraid of the possibility that her help might be taken for granted, or her generosity exploited. Reverend Hale spoke then of his own failure, which had been one of moral leadership rather than direct action. He had seen what was happening, had understood that procedures were being used as obstacles rather than as safeguards, had recognised that the Carrows were being allowed to slip through the gaps in the town's charitable framework. Yet he had chosen peace over justice, had preferred to maintain harmony among his congregation, rather than risk discord by insisting that they confront their own reluctance to help those who made them uncomfortable. He had preached about charity in the abstract whilst failing to demand it in the specific, and this failure, he believed, was perhaps the most consequential of all, for it had allowed others to believe their inaction was acceptable because it went unchallenged by their spiritual shepherd. These confessions, delivered without theatricality and received without judgment, created in that small study an atmosphere quite unlike the usual tenor of such gatherings. There was relief in the speaking, certainly, the relief which comes when burdens long carried in isolation are at last set down in the presence of others willing to acknowledge their weight. But there was also a quality of genuine reckoning, an understanding that what was being discussed was not merely an unfortunate episode in the town's history, but a revelation of character, both individual and collective, which demanded more than regret or resolution. It demanded, if anything meaningful were to follow, a willingness to change not merely behaviour, but the assumptions which had shaped that behaviour. Mr. Everard, listening to these admissions with the patient, attention which had marked all his interactions that Christmas season, ventured at last to speak of the note which had set in motion this day of reckoning. He revealed, for he had deduced it through his careful examination of postal records and through considerations of timing and knowledge, that the note had almost certainly been written by one of the Carrow children now grown to adulthood, who had returned briefly to Cranley Hollow and had chosen this means of ensuring that the family's experience would not be entirely forgotten by the community which had failed them. The note had not demanded restitution, it had not threatened exposure or revenge, it had simply stated facts, provided dates, reminded specific individuals of specific decisions and their consequences, and it had concluded with a question which, while phrased gently, carried nonetheless a weight which could not be dismissed. It had asked whether the town believed that its treatment of the Carrow family represented the kind of community it wished to be, and if not, what it intended to do differently when next faced with similar circumstances. This question, Mr. Everard suggested, was the true gift the note had offered, though it was a gift wrapped in discomfort rather than in pleasure, for it provided an opportunity, rare and valuable, to examine honestly what had been done, to acknowledge what had been left undone, and to consider how the lessons of that difficult winter might be applied to ensure that future winters were navigated with more courage and more genuine charity. The conversation which followed this revelation ranged across many subjects, from the practical matter of how to honour the Carrow family's memory to the broader question of how charitable efforts in Cranley Hollow might be reformed to prevent similar failures. There was discussion of establishing a fund dedicated to emergency assistance, to be administered with less procedural delay and more trust in the judgment of those directly familiar with cases of need. There was talk of creating some memorial, not grand but genuine, which would acknowledge the town's debt to those it had failed, and its commitment to doing better by those who might need its help in future. But more important than any specific plan or proposal was the quality of the discussion itself, which was marked by honesty rather than by posturing, by genuine searching rather than by comfortable certainty. It was, all four participants understood, only a beginning. The habit of kindness exercised at convenience rather than at cost would not be overcome through a single conversation or reformed through a single resolution. But it was, nonetheless, a beginning, and that was something which had not existed when the Christmas morning bells had first rung out over Cranley Hollow's frosted lanes. Chapter 8. The Cost of Being Kind Alone. The evening service at St. Edmund's was attended, as Christmas services always were, by a congregation larger and more varied than that which appeared on ordinary Sundays. There were those who came from genuine devotion, those who came from habit, those who came because it would be remarked upon if they did not, and those who came seeking that particular species of peace which sacred spaces offer even to souls uncertain of their faith. The church, illuminated by candles which cast dancing shadows upon walls that had witnessed generations of worship, possessed that evening an atmosphere both festive and solemn, as though aware that its role was to contain contradictions rather than resolve them. Mr. Everard, arriving neither early nor late, but at precisely that moment which would draw least attention to his entrance, took his customary place in a pew toward the rear of the church. From this vantage point he could observe the assembled townspeople without himself becoming an object of observation, a position which suited both his temperament and his purposes. He noted who sat with whom, who avoided whose gaze, who appeared at ease, and who manifested that particular tension, which suggests a mind at war with itself. Mrs. Cole sat in her usual prominent position, dressed in her finest clothing and wearing an expression of determined cheerfulness, which did not quite extend to her eyes. Mr. Hayes occupied a pew which spoke of his prosperity, accompanied by his wife, whose attention seemed divided between the service and a continuous assessment of the social landscape around them. Miss Brown sat alone, her posture suggesting someone who had come seeking answers to questions she could not voice aloud. And Reverend Hale, preparing to lead his congregation in worship, bore upon his face that mixture of hope and apprehension which marks those who must perform public duties whilst wrestling with private uncertainties. The service proceeded according to its ancient rhythms, the familiar words and hymns providing a structure within which individual thoughts could wander, whilst appearing to remain appropriately focused upon communal devotion. Yet there was observable throughout the congregation a quality of distraction, a sense that minds were engaged with matters other than the liturgy, that the prayers being spoken aloud were accompanied by other prayers, more urgent and more personal, being offered silently within troubled hearts. It was during his sermon that Reverend Hale departed from his prepared text, a departure so subtle that many in the congregation might not have noticed it had they not been already attuned to undercurrents of meaning. He spoke as he had intended of the Christmas story, of the Holy Family's journey to Bethlehem, of the birth in humble circumstances, of the visit from shepherds who brought nothing but their wonder and their witness. But as he developed these themes, his emphasis shifted from the traditional focus on divine grace to a more earthly consideration of hospitality and welcome, of how communities respond to strangers in need, of the difference between charity offered in comfort and mercy extended at cost. He spoke of the innkeeper who had no room and asked his congregation to consider whether that innkeeper had truly had no room, or whether he had simply had no room for these particular travellers, these people without connections or means or any claim upon his attention beyond their simple need. He spoke of the shepherds, outcasts themselves, being the first to receive news of the birth, and suggested that perhaps there was significance in the fact that God had chosen to announce this momentous event not to the respectable and established, but to those who dwelt on the margins of their community. And then, with a gentleness that made his words more rather than less pointed, he spoke of winters in general, and this winter in particular, of how cold can test the warmth of Christian fellowship, of how scarcity can reveal what abundance obscures, of how the true measure of a community's character lies not in how it treats those who belong, but in how it treats those who do not quite belong. Not yet, perhaps not ever. Mr. Everard, listening from his rear pew, understood that the Reverend had chosen to speak plainly at last, or as plainly as his position and his temperament allowed. It was not an accusation, not quite, but neither was it the comfortable homily which the congregation might have expected, and perhaps preferred. It was rather an invitation to reflection, an acknowledgement that something had been left undone, and a suggestion that the season itself, with its themes of redemption and renewal, offered an opportunity to address old failings with new resolve. The response from the congregation was difficult to gauge with precision. There were no audible protests, no dramatic departures, but neither was there the comfortable murmur of agreement which typically greeted sermons that confirmed existing virtues without challenging existing assumptions. Instead, there was a quality of stillness, of attention held suspended between acceptance and resistance, as though each person present was engaged in a private calculation of whether to receive these words as balm or as reproach. After the service concluded, as the congregation emerged into the cold night air, the usual fellowship which characterized such occasions took a form somewhat altered from custom. Conversations were briefer, more carefully navigated. There was less lingering in the churchyard, less casual gathering into small groups for extended discussion of the service and other matters. People departed with unusual promptness for their homes, as though seeking the privacy required for thoughts not yet ready to be shared. Mr. Everard, however, found himself approached by several individuals who seemed to have been waiting for an opportunity to speak with him privately. The first was young Timothy Marsh, who asked, with the directness which marks those not yet schooled in adult evasions, whether Mr. Everard knew what the Reverend had been speaking of in his sermon. Mr. Orskis Everard replied that he believed the Reverend had been speaking of kindness and its costs, of memory and its obligations, and that these were matters each person must consider according to their own understanding and conscience. The second was Miss Brown, who asked whether Mr. Everard thought it possible to make amends for failures long past, or whether some opportunities once missed could never be recovered. Mr. Everard answered that while one could not undo what had been done or do what had been left undone, one could acknowledge honestly what had transpired, could learn from it, and could resolve to act differently when future occasions demanded. This, he suggested, was perhaps not redemption in the theological sense, but it was beginning, and beginnings were not to be dismissed as worthless merely because they could not erase what had preceded them. The third was Mrs. Cole, who declared with more vehemence than the situation seemed to warrant that she had always believed the town did its best by everyone, that resources had been limited, that difficult choices had been necessary, and that surely no one could be blamed for exercising reasonable prudence in the distribution of charitable assistance. Mr. Everard listened to this declaration with his characteristic patience, and when she had finished, he observed mildly that the question was perhaps not whether anyone could be blamed, but whether anything could be learned, not whether the town had meant well, but whether it had done well, not whether intentions had been good, but whether outcomes had been just. Mrs. Cole received this observation with a stiffness which suggested it had struck closer to home than she wished to acknowledge, and departed with fewer words than she had arrived with, leaving Mr. Everard to reflect that truth, however gently delivered, retains a capacity to discomfort which courtesy alone cannot entirely eliminate. As the churchyard emptied, and Mr. Everard prepared to make his own departure, Reverend Hale approached with an expression which combined relief and apprehension in equal measure. He inquired whether Mr. Everard felt he had spoken too directly, whether his words might have caused offence which could have been avoided through greater care in their delivery. Mr. Everard considered the question with the seriousness it deserved before responding that the Reverend had spoken as his conscience had required, that such speaking was itself a form of courage, and that the discomfort which truth sometimes occasions is not a reason to prefer comfortable falsehood. The cost of being kind alone, he suggested, was discovering that one's kindness was insufficient. But the cost of being kind together, of sharing both the burden and the credit of genuine charity, was considerably less than the cost of allowing opportunities for mercy to slip past unrecognised and unheeded. The two men parted with an understanding that something had shifted in Cranleg Hollow that day, that the whispers which had characterised the morning had given way by evening to something approaching speech, and that what would follow in the days ahead would depend upon whether that speech would prove honest or evasive, brave or convenient, transformative or merely performative. Mr. Everard walked home through streets now silent and dark, where windows glowed with the warmth of hearth fires and families gathered for their Christmas evening. And he carried with him a hope, fragile but genuine, that the town might yet find the courage to face its past honestly and to shape its future differently. Chapter 7. Winters that Taught Silence. Memory, that most selective of human faculties, possesses an unfortunate tendency to preserve what is comfortable whilst allowing what is painful to fade into indistinction, much as a portrait left too long in sunlight that will lose its darker tones whilst retaining its more pleasant hues. Yet there are occasions when the very act of communal forgetting becomes itself a form of remembrance, when the careful avoidance of certain subjects speaks as loudly as their mention would, and when silence itself becomes a kind of testimony to truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge directly. The winter of which we speak, that winter which had haunted the margins of this Christmas Day's consciousness, had been remarkable not merely for its severity but for its timing. It had followed a year of poor harvests, of trade disrupted by difficulties on the continent, of small reverses which individually meant little, but which collectively created a climate of uncertainty and retrenchment. Cranley Hollow, like many such towns, had weathered harder times and would weather harder times again, But this particular winter had found its resources depleted and its spirits low, and had tested in ways both subtle and direct the bonds of community which easier seasons had allowed the town to take for granted. The Carrow family had arrived in Cranley Hollow some 3 years prior to this difficult season, drawn by the promise of employment in the timber trade which was then expanding under Mr. Hayes's energetic direction. Thomas Carrow had been a skilled carpenter, a man whose work showed both competence and care, and for a time he had found steady employment and sufficient wages to support his wife Mary and their 3 children, the eldest of whom was perhaps 10 years of age, the youngest still learning to walk. They had taken lodgings in a cottage at the edge of the town, a small dwelling which nevertheless represented for them a considerable improvement over their previous circumstances. Mary Carrow had been observed to keep the place neat despite its limitations, and the children, though boisterous as children will be, had been generally well behaved and presentable. The family had attended services at St. Edmund's with reasonable regularity, and had comported themselves with that particular dignity which marks people determined to prove their respectability through careful attention to propriety. Yet they had remained, in some essential way, outside the town's inner circle. They knew no one's grandparents, shared no childhood memories with the other residents, had no place in the complex web of obligation and affection which bound Cranleg Hollow's established families. They were not disliked, merely unfamiliar, and in a community where identity was so thoroughly rooted in shared history, this unfamiliarity placed them perpetually at a disadvantage they could not overcome through any amount of exemplary behaviour. The accident which would prove the catalyst for their ultimate departure had occurred on a grey November morning. Thomas Carrow, working on the construction of a new warehouse, had fallen from a height of perhaps 15 feet when timber improperly secured had shifted beneath him. The fall had shattered his left leg and injured his back in ways which, while not immediately apparent, would prove more enduring than the more obvious wound. In a community more tightly bound, such an accident would have prompted immediate and unstinting assistance. Meals would have been brought, rent would have been paid from some collective fund, and employment would have been found for the injured man as soon as he was able to work at tasks less physically demanding than those his former position required. But the Carrows, lacking the deep connections which would have triggered such automatic support, found themselves instead subject to processes more formal and considerably less generous. Mr. Hayes, whose business had been responsible for the worksite where the accident occurred, had paid for the initial medical treatment with a promptness which spoke more of liability concerns than compassion. But when it became clear that Thomas Carrow's recovery would be measured in months rather than weeks, and when questions arose about whether proper safety measures had been observed, Mr. Hayes's solicitude had cooled considerably. There were suggestions, never quite stated directly, that Carrow had been careless, that he had perhaps been working above his capabilities, that the accident, while unfortunate, was not the responsibility of anyone but the injured man himself. The charitable committee, of which Miss Brown had been so active a member, had taken up the family's case with what appeared to be genuine concern. Meetings had been held, resources had been assessed, and various courses of action had been debated, with the thoroughness which marks committees determined to proceed according to proper principles. But while these deliberations continued, winter had deepened, Thomas Carrow's savings had been exhausted, and the family's circumstances had grown increasingly desperate. Mary Carrow had sought work where she could find it, taking in washing and mending, despite having 3 young children to care for and a husband whose injury required constant attention. The children, sensing perhaps the strain their parents laboured to conceal, had become quiet in ways that children should not be quiet, their natural exuberance subdued by a premature awareness of necessity. And Thomas Carrow himself, confined to a bed he had no choice but to accept as his world, had struggled with that particular species of helplessness which afflicts those accustomed to supporting others through their own labour. It was Mrs. Cole who had expressed in conversations whose influence she would later minimise the concerns which had given others license to temper their charitable impulses with prudence. Was it wise, she had inquired, with every appearance of genuine solicitude, To commit resources to a family whose connection to Cranley Hollow was so recent? Might there not be relations elsewhere better positioned to provide assistance? And was there not some question about whether Thomas Carrow's injury was quite as debilitating as he claimed, given that he had been seen on one occasion moving about with less difficulty than his appeals for help seemed to suggest? This last observation, based upon a single glimpse of Carrow attempting to reach the privy, unaided during a period when his pain had temporarily subsided, had done perhaps more damage than any other single factor. For it had provided those who wished to be cautious with a justification for their caution, had transformed what might have been seen as admirable stoicism into suspected malingering, and had allowed the town to preserve its self-image as charitable whilst declining to provide charity in any form that might prove inconvenient. Reverend Hale had preached during that winter sermons on the themes of Christian duty and neighbourly love, sermons which his congregation had received with nods of approval and promptly set aside as soon as the practical question of implementing such principles arose. He had spoken privately with various town worthies about the Carrow situation, and had been assured that matters were being handled, that proper procedures were being followed, that help would be forthcoming as soon as certain formalities were completed. But formalities, as Mr. Everard had observed through his handling of the family's correspondence, had a remarkable capacity to multiply when their completion might lead to actions people were reluctant to take. Forms required additional forms, questions prompted further questions, and always there was one more piece of information needed, one more verification required, one more committee meeting to be scheduled before any decisive action could be authorised. By the time spring arrived, bringing with it the tentative warmth which promised relief from winter's hardships, the Carrows had departed. They left quietly, without announcement or farewell, settling what debts they could and abandoning what they could not. The cottage they had occupied was let within a fortnight to another family, and within a month it was as though the Carrows had never resided in Cranley Hollow at all. The town, relieved of an obligation it had never quite acknowledged, and uncomfortable with questions it preferred not to answer, had allowed itself to forget. Not deliberately, not with conscious malice, but with that gentle erosion of memory which comes naturally to communities which have found the past inconvenient. The Carrows became, in the collective recollection, a family who had tried their luck in Cranley Hollow and found it wanting, who had moved on to better prospects elsewhere, who had been unfortunate, but no more so than many others in those difficult times. Only a few, like Mr. Everard, had retained clear memories of what had truly transpired. Only a few had noticed that the town's version of events contained significant omissions, and only a few had been troubled by the distance between what had happened and what was said to have happened. But now, on this Christmas Day, those memories had been summoned back into presence. The note had performed that service, had insisted that the town remember accurately rather than comfortably, and the whispers which had filled the day had been, in their own way, the sound of a community beginning to acknowledge truths it had long declined to face. Chapter 6. What seemed true for a time. The gathering dusk of Christmas afternoon brought with it that peculiar quality of light which transforms the familiar into something slightly foreign, casting shadows where none had been noticed before, and revealing contours which the harsher illumination of midday had somehow obscured. Mr. Thomas Everard, having completed his various rounds and conversations, found himself drawn back to the post office, that modest establishment which had been for more than a decade both his place of employment and his principal window upon the life of Cranley Hollow. The office was closed naturally, it being Christmas Day, but Mr. Everard possessed a key and a certain licence to attend to matters which could not await the resumption of regular business hours. He entered the dim interior with the ease of long habituation, lighting a single lamp which cast a warm but limited circle of illumination in the gathering gloom. The sorting room with its pigeonholes and cubbies, its scales and stamps and registers, had about it an air of patient waiting, like a theatre between performances, ready to resume its function, but for the moment suspended in quietude. It was here, among the records and remnants of correspondence past, that Mr. Everard began a careful examination of materials which had long resided in the back reaches of the office's storage. He worked methodically, without haste, sorting through bundles of old letters and packages which had gone unclaimed, examining postmarks and addresses with the practiced eye of one who reads in such mundane details the larger stories of human connection and disconnection. What emerged from this patient archaeology was a pattern which, once perceived, seemed almost inevitable in its clarity. During the winter in question, there had been a marked increase in correspondence directed to various charitable institutions and relief societies, letters bearing the address of Cranley Hollow, but clearly written by hands unfamiliar with the forms and protocols which such petitions typically required. These were the letters of desperate people unschooled in the art of asking for help from official sources, people who wrote with more honesty than strategy. Many of these letters had been returned, marked as insufficiently addressed or lacking proper documentation. Others had been forwarded to London offices, where they had presumably been received, processed and filed away, according to procedures which bore no relation to the urgency with which they had been written. And a very few, had been answered with forms requesting additional information which would have required resources the petitioners clearly did not possess to provide. Mr. Everard found himself particularly arrested by one letter, written in a careful hand that betrayed both limited education and considerable determination. It was addressed to a charitable trust, which he knew, from his own reading of such matters, to have been defunct for some years prior to the date of the letter's composition. Someone, so it seemed, had provided this address as a source of potential assistance without bothering to verify whether such assistance was still available. The letter had been returned to the post office marked as undeliverable and had rested in the unclaimed correspondence since that time. He read it now by lamplight, this artifact of hope disappointed. It spoke of a husband unable to work due to injury, of children in need of clothing and shoes, of rent unpaid and creditors growing impatient. It asked not for charity in the sense of free gifts, but merely for assistance in obtaining employment, or perhaps a small loan which could be repaid once circumstances improved. It was written with dignity, with that particular pride which marks people who have not yet become accustomed to dependency, and who still believe that their situation is temporary, requiring only a small intervention to set right. The letter was signed with a name that Mr. Everard had heard mentioned, obliquely, in the conversation of this strange Christmas day. Thomas Carrow. The family had been the Carrows then, Thomas and Mary Carrow, with their 3 children whose names he could not recall being spoken even once in all the years since their departure. Other discoveries followed as Mr. Everard continued his careful examination. There were receipts for money orders sent but never cashed, suggesting funds directed toward the family, which had somehow failed to reach their intended recipients. There were records of packages dispatched from addresses in other towns, packages which the Carrows had perhaps arranged to be sent to themselves through relations elsewhere, only to depart before these small reserves could arrive. And there was correspondence between various local worthies discussing the family's situation in terms which managed to be both concerned and dismissive, sympathetic and sceptical, charitable in sentiment yet parsimonious in proposed action. What had seemed true for a time, Mr. Everard reflected as he carefully restored these papers to their proper places, was that the Carrows had been unfortunate but not particularly deserving, desperate but not quite desperate enough, in need but not in such immediate need that delay would prove catastrophic. These assessments had been made, he understood now, not from cruelty but from that very human tendency to shape facts to fit the actions one is prepared to take, rather than to allow facts to dictate what actions necessity demands. The town had wished to help, but had wished even more to help in ways which were comfortable, controlled and consistent with existing protocols. And when the Carrows, whether through pride or practicality, had failed to conform to these protocols, the town had allowed itself to believe that perhaps the situation was not as dire as it had appeared, that perhaps the family had other resources they were not disclosing, that perhaps, in the end, their departure proved they had not needed the town's help as desperately as they had claimed. Mr. Everard's own connection to these events was one he had long contemplated in the privacy of his conscience. He had been in that winter a younger man newly established in his position, eager to please his superiors and uncertain of his own judgment. When questions had arisen about the proper handling of the Carrows' correspondence, when decisions had needed to be made about which letters to expedite and which could wait, he had deferred to those with greater experience and supposedly greater wisdom. He had told himself that this was appropriate, that one did not presume to override the judgments of one's betters without cause. But he had known, even then, that some of those judgments were shaped less by wisdom than by convenience, less by assessment of genuine need than by considerations of social standing and local preference. And he had remained silent, had facilitated rather than questioned, had served the machinery of organised indifference with the same efficiency he brought to all his duties. It was this silence, more than any action taken or withheld, which had weighed upon him in the years since. For he had learned, through experience both bitter and instructive, that there are moments when duty requires not obedience but resistance, not compliance but courage. The Carrows had needed someone to stand in the machinery and insist that it operate differently, or failing that, to bypass the machinery entirely and render assistance through whatever means were available. But no one had done so, and Mr. Everard, who had been positioned to see most clearly what was happening, had chosen the safety of his position over the risk of advocacy. The note which had circulated that morning, he understood now with complete certainty, had been written by someone who knew these facts, who had observed these failures, and who had chosen this day to ensure that the town's comfortable forgetting was interrupted by inconvenient remembrance. Whether that someone was Thomas Carrow himself, or his wife, or perhaps one of their children grown to adulthood, or even some other party with knowledge of these events, he could not determine with certainty. But the note's purpose was clear enough. It was not seeking revenge in the dramatic sense, not demanding restitution in the material sense. It was simply insisting, with a firmness that could not be ignored, that what had happened be acknowledged as having happened, that the town's version of events be revised to accord with truth rather than with comfort, and that the Carrows be restored at minimum to the dignity of being remembered accurately rather than forgotten conveniently. As Mr. Everard extinguished the lamp and prepared to depart for the evening service, he carried with him a resolution which had been forming throughout the day's encounters and discoveries. The town would need to face what it had done, not through accusation or condemnation, but through the simple act of honest recognition, and he, who had failed once through silence, would not fail again. The time for whispers, he believed, was drawing to its close. The time for speaking plainly was at hand. Chapter 5, Faces Turned Toward Familiar Comforts. The afternoon hours of Christmas Day possess a particular character in towns such as Cranleg Hollow, where the rhythms of life are governed less by the mechanical precision of clocks than by the organic progression of light and custom. The midday meal having been consumed, the evening service yet to come, there exists a pocket of time wherein the townspeople retreat into their domestic sanctuaries, seeking in the familiar arrangements of hearth and family the comfort which the wider world, with its complications and uncertainties, sometimes fails to provide. Mr. Leonard Hayes sat in his parlour, a room whose every appointment spoke of prosperity achieved through means at once legitimate and somehow unsatisfying in their very legitimacy. The furniture was new, the carpet unstained, the paintings upon the walls chosen more for their costliness than for any particular aesthetic merit. It was a room which announced, with perhaps more insistence than confidence, that its owner had arrived at a station in life worthy of respect, and it was this very insistence which betrayed the relative recency of that arrival. Mr. Hayes himself was a man of middling height and unremarkable features, save for a certain tightness about the mouth which suggested a habitual vigilance against allowing more than he intended to show. He had come to Cranleg Hollow some 15 years prior, establishing himself in the timber trade with an acumen that had been remarked upon favourably by those who benefited from it, and less favourably by those who found themselves outmanoeuvred in various commercial negotiations. He was not, it should be said, dishonest in his dealings, but neither was he burdened by excessive scruple when opportunity presented itself in forms that might, to more fastidious sensibilities, have appeared questionable. His wife, a woman considerably younger than himself and possessed of that brittle prettiness which seems always on the verge of revealing the effort required to maintain it, sat across from him engaged in needlework of an ornamental rather than practical nature. Between them, on a low table, sat a decanter of port which Mr. Hayes had been addressing with a frequency that suggested its consumption served some purpose beyond mere refreshment. The conversation between them, such as it was, consisted largely of Mrs. Hayes's observations regarding the comparative merits of various families' Christmas displays, the quality of Mrs. Cole's goose as glimpsed through her window, and the general satisfactoriness of their own circumstances as measured against those of their neighbours. These remarks were delivered in a tone of complacent superiority which her husband received with absent-minded agreement, his thoughts clearly occupied elsewhere. It was the peculiar torture of Mr. Hayes's position that he could not speak of what truly troubled him without revealing information he had no wish to share. The note which he had received in the cold hours of early morning had been brief but unnervingly specific. It had mentioned dates, transactions, opportunities indeed seized at moments when others were too preoccupied with their own troubles to notice. It had made no accusations in the legal sense, had threatened no exposure, had demanded nothing. But it had made clear that someone knew, someone remembered, and someone had chosen this day of all days to ensure that he remembered too. The winter in question had been, for Mr. Hayes, a season of unexpected advantage. A competitor had fallen upon hard times, made worse by the presence of an injured worker whose compensation had drained the man's already precarious resources. Property had been sold, contracts had been reassigned, and when the difficulty had passed, Mr. Hayes had found himself in possession of opportunities which would have taken years to acquire through ordinary means. He had done nothing illegal, he assured it himself. He had simply been available when others were desperate, and had paid fair prices for what was offered, even if those prices were considerably less than what might have been obtained in more stable circumstances. But the note had framed these transactions differently, had placed them in a context which rendered them less comfortable to recall. It had suggested, without quite stating, that his prosperity had been built upon foundations less solid than he had allowed himself to believe, and that the forgetting which had served the town so well had served him particularly well indeed. Across the town, in her considerably more modest dwelling, Miss Eliza Brown sat before a fire that had burned low, neglected during her extended absence at the church. She had returned home with the intention of resting before the evening service, but rest had proven elusive. Her mind returned repeatedly to the conversation with Mr. Everard, to the confession she had made, and to the questions which that confession had raised without answering. She had been, in that difficult winter, a young woman of limited means but considerable energy, newly arrived to Cranleigh Hollow and eager to make herself useful. The charitable committee had seemed a natural place to direct her enthusiasms, and she had thrown herself into its work with an earnestness which, she now recognised, had been more concerned with the appearance of doing good than with the actual accomplishment of it. She had attended meetings faithfully, had recorded minutes with meticulous care, had drafted letters and compiled reports with a thoroughness that had earned praise from her fellow committee members. But when action had been required, when the machinery of organised charity had needed to be set aside in favour of direct and immediate assistance, she had hesitated. There had been proper channels to follow, she had argued. There had been precedents to consider, and the danger of setting expectations which could not be sustained. Better to proceed carefully, to ensure that help, when given, was given in a manner that would serve as a model for future cases. Better to take the time to do things properly than to rush forward with solutions that might, in the long term, prove counterproductive. The family, of course, had not had the luxury of waiting for the long term. They had needed help in the immediate term, the urgent term, the term measured not in committee meetings and formal applications, but in meals missed, and children shivering in inadequate clothing, and a father growing desperate as his injury failed to heal, and his debts mounted beyond any hope of repayment. Miss Brown rose and stirred the fire back to reluctant life, adding coal with hands that trembled slightly. She had told herself in the years since that she had done her best under difficult circumstances. She had reminded herself that the resources available had been genuinely limited, that choices had been necessary, that one could not help everyone and must therefore make rational decisions about how to direct one's efforts. These thoughts had provided a measure of comfort, had allowed her to continue her charitable work without being paralysed by doubt. But the note, which had arrived that morning wrapped in plain paper and bearing no signature, had stripped away these comfortable rationalizations. It had not been cruel, had not accused her of wickedness or callousness. It had simply asked, in language both gentle and devastating, whether she had been more concerned with appearing charitable than with being charitable, whether her commitment to proper procedure had served as a shield against the discomfort of genuine sacrifice. Mrs. Cole, in her own kitchen, found herself unable to settle to any task, despite the many demands which the preparation of Christmas dinner traditionally imposed. She moved from table to stove to pantry with an agitation quite unlike her usual purposeful efficiency, picking up implements only to set them down again, checking the goose with a frequency which suggested anxiety rather than care. She had not received the note herself, but she had learned of it through channels which, while indirect, were nonetheless reliable. And she understood, with the clarity which comes to those whose social position depends upon their ability to read the undercurrents of community sentiment, that her own role in the events of that winter had not gone unnoticed or unrecorded. Mrs. Cole's particular contribution had been one of influence rather than decision. She had not sat on the charitable committee, had held no official position which would have placed her in the path of formal responsibility. But she had possessed, as she still possessed, that quality of social authority which shapes opinion through suggestion rather than decree. A word here, a doubt raised there, a concern expressed in just the right company, and the momentum of charitable intention could be slowed, redirected, or allowed to dissipate entirely. She had not meant harm, she told herself. She had simply exercised appropriate caution. The family had been newcomers, their circumstances unclear, their claims unverified by long acquaintance. It had seemed only prudent to ensure that charity was directed first toward those whose characters were well known and whose worthiness was established by years of respectable behaviour. This was not cruelty, she had believed. This was wisdom. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the time for evening service approached, Mrs. Cole found herself haunted by the memory of a woman's face, glimpsed briefly months after that difficult winter in the market square. The woman had looked at her with an expression which contained no anger, no accusation, but only a tired understanding, and then she had turned away, and shortly thereafter Mrs. Cole had learned the family had left Cranley Hollow entirely. The town, in that quiet afternoon hour, retreated into familiar comforts, but the comfort for some was proving less sustaining than it once had been. Chapter 4. Questions asked softly enough. There exists a particular art to inquiry which is understood instinctively by those whose circumstances have taught them the value of discretion. It is an art which depends not upon the directness of one's questions, but rather upon the creation of a space wherein answers may emerge naturally, like flowers opening to the sun, requiring no force but only the proper conditions of warmth and safety. Mr. Mr. Thomas Everard, whose position in the town had long placed him in receipt of confidences both sought and unsought, had cultivated this art to a degree of considerable refinement. The afternoon found him at the vicarage, where Reverend Hale had invited him to partake of a modest luncheon before the evening service. The vicarage was a building of comfortable unpretentiousness, its rooms furnished with that mixture of inherited pieces and charitable donations which characterizes the dwellings of clergy whose calling provided spiritual riches in inverse proportion to material ones. The study, where the two men sat with their cold meats and bread, was lined with books that showed the wear of genuine use, and the window looked out upon a garden which, though dormant now in winter's grip, spoke through its careful layout of the patient attention lavished upon it in more temperate seasons. Reverend Hale was not a man given to small talk, yet neither was he comfortable with the weightier subjects which this day seemed to press upon him from all sides. He spoke therefore of matters tangential, of the sermon he had prepared for the evening, of the satisfactory turnout expected despite the cold, of small repairs needed to the church roof which might, with careful economy, be addressed come spring. Mr. Everard listened with his customary patience, understanding that these preliminary wanderings were themselves a form of communication, a circling of the true subject much as a bird circled before landing. It was only when the meal was concluded and both men sat with their tea that the Reverend's discourse took a more personal turn. He spoke almost as though thinking aloud of the peculiar challenges faced by those who minister to a community where every soul is known and every history shared. There was, he observed, a tendency among people to mistake familiarity for understanding, to assume that because one knew the outward circumstances of a person's life, one therefore comprehended the inner workings of their heart and mind. This tendency, he continued with growing thoughtfulness, could lead to errors of judgment which, though committed with the best of intentions, nonetheless resulted in consequences both real and lasting. A person's needs might be assessed according to what seemed reasonable from the outside rather than what was actually felt within. A situation might be deemed manageable because it had not yet reached crisis, even though the parties involved experienced it as desperate, and decisions might be delayed in the name of prudence when what was truly needed was swift and decisive action. Mr. Everard, recognising in these abstract reflections a more specific struggle, ventured to inquire whether the Reverend was speaking of any particular circumstance. The question was posed gently, without pressure, offering an opening which could be taken or declined as the Reverend's comfort dictated. Reverend Hale was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon the teacup in his hands as though it might contain some answer to questions he had not yet found words to ask. When he spoke again, his voice carried that quality of confession which emerges when the weight of private guilt seeks at last the relief of shared acknowledgement. He spoke of a winter, not so many years past, when the town had faced hardships that tested the limits of its charitable resources. There had been much suffering, much genuine need, and the means available to address these needs had been painfully inadequate. In such circumstances, he said, one was forced to make choices, to determine priorities, to decide who might be helped immediately and who might reasonably be expected to wait. These were not choices anyone wished to make, but they were, he believed then and believed still, necessary ones. Yet there had been one family, he admitted, whose situation had troubled him more than others. Their needs had been clear, their suffering evident. But there had been complications, considerations which had given him pause. The family was not originally from Cranley Hollow, having arrived only a few years prior. They had no deep roots in the community, no extensive network of relations and long-standing friendships to call upon, and while this should not, in any Christian calculus, have diminished their claim to assistance, it had, he confessed with evident pain, influenced the urgency with which their case was treated. There had been meetings, consultations, careful deliberations about the best course of action. Papers had been prepared, applications submitted to various charitable trusts and parish funds. But while these proper procedures were being followed, while forms were being reviewed and decisions contemplated, the family's circumstances had continued to deteriorate. The husband's injury had not healed as hoped. The wife's health had declined under the strain. The children, though brave, had suffered from cold and hunger that no child should be asked to endure. In the end, the family had left, departing in the early spring for some other place where they hoped, perhaps, to find better fortune or at least less bureaucratic impediment to simple human kindness. The Reverend had learned of their departure only after the fact, and had been assured by others that it was, all things considered, probably for the best. The family would have a fresh start elsewhere. The town's limited resources could be directed toward those with stronger claims to local support. It was a practical solution to a difficult problem, but it had not, Reverend Hale admitted with a heaviness that bowed his shoulders, been a just solution. It had not been a merciful solution. It had been an expedient solution, one which allowed those who remained to return to their comfortable assumption that they had done their duty, that they were good people living in a good town, that no wrong had been committed, because no law had been broken and no malice had been intended. He had prayed over this matter many times in the years since, the Reverend said. He had examined his conscience with what rigour he could muster, and while he could not say that the decisions made had been entirely wrong given the constraints they faced, neither could he say they had been entirely right. There was, he believed, a difference between doing what was possible and doing what was necessary, and he feared that in that winter's crisis they had settled too readily for the former when the latter had been required. Mr. Everard listened to this unburdening with the deep attention it deserved. He did not rush to offer comfort, nor did he agree with easy assurances that all had been done that could be done. Instead, he asked a question which, though simple in its construction, cut to the heart of the matter. Did the Reverend know what had become of the family after they left Cranley Hollow? The Reverend shook his head slowly. There had been no word, no subsequent communication. They had simply vanished from the town's consciousness as completely as though they had never existed. Their names, which he struggled now to recall with any clarity, had faded from memory. Their faces had become indistinct. Even the precise details of their circumstances had grown hazy, overlaid by time and by the human tendency to smooth the rough edges from uncomfortable recollections. It was this forgetting, perhaps more than the original failing, which troubled him most deeply now, for it suggested that the family had mattered to Cranley Hollow only insofar as their presence had created an inconvenient obligation, and that once they were gone, that obligation had been gratefully relinquished. They had become, in the town's collective memory, merely an abstraction, a lesson about the difficulties of charitable work, rather than specific human souls who had suffered specific human hurts. As Mr. Everard prepared to take his leave, the Reverend asked, with a directness unusual for him, whether Mr. Everard knew who had written the note and what precisely it contained. For he had not himself received a copy, yet the effects of its circulation were evident throughout the town, and he could not help but feel that it concerned, in some fashion, the very matters they had been discussing. Mr. Everard's response was characteristically measured. He could not, he said, speak to the note's authorship or its precise contents, as these were not matters within his certain knowledge. But he could say, with confidence born of long observation, that sometimes the past sought not punishment but merely acknowledgement, not revenge but recognition. And perhaps, he suggested gently, the note was best understood not as an accusation, but as an invitation to remember what had been too readily forgotten. With this thought he departed, leaving Reverend Hale to his preparations for the evening service and to his conscience, which was, after all, the more demanding of the two. Chapter 3, Whispers That Knew Their Way. If there be any truth to the notion that walls possess ears, then surely it must be acknowledged that whispers possess feet, for they travel with remarkable efficiency through the corridors and byways of a close-knit community, finding their destinations with an unerring accuracy that would put the most skilled navigator to shame. In Cranley Hollow, where proximity had bred not contempt but rather an intricate understanding of one another's habits and histories, information moved along channels worn smooth by generations of use, requiring no formal announcement to reach those for whom it was intended. As the morning advanced toward midday, and the sun climbed higher in a sky of that peculiar winter blue, which seems more suggestion than assertion, Mr. Everard found himself drawn by what mixture of duty and curiosity he could not entirely say, toward the church where preparations for the Christmas service were underway. The path took him past the baker's shop where Mr. William Finch was arranging loaves with the particular pride of a craftsman whose work, though consumed and forgotten within hours, represents none the less a daily triumph of skill over the intractable nature of flour and yeast. Mr. Finch, a stout man whose perpetual coating of flour dust gave him the appearance of having been caught in a particularly localized snowfall, greeted Mr. Everard with the heartiness common to those whose labour is physical and whose conscience is, generally speaking, untroubled. Yet even here, in this bastion of simple industry and straightforward commerce, there was observable a certain constraint in the conversation. Mr. Finch spoke of the weather with unusual attention to detail. He remarked upon the quality of this year's wheat harvest with more philosophical reflection than the subject perhaps warranted, and when his wife appeared briefly from the back room, her glance toward Mr. Everard carried that fleeting expression of inquiry which suggested she too was aware that something hung unspoken in the air. It was, Mr. Everard reflected as he continued on his way, rather like watching the surface of a pond disturbed by some unseen stone. The ripples spread outward in ever-widening circles, touching shores they had no apparent connection to, yet undeniably present, undeniably real. The note had created such a disturbance, and the town was responding with the natural instinct of any organism presented with a foreign element, attempting to understand it, contain it, or somehow incorporate it into the existing order of things. At the church he encountered young Timothy Marsh, the sexton's son, a lad of perhaps 14 years, whose duties included the ringing of bells and the maintenance of those 1,000 small details which keep a house of worship fit for its sacred purpose. Timothy was engaged in sweeping the church steps with an energy that suggested either exceptional devotion to cleanliness or needed to occupy himself with vigorous activity, and when he paused to acknowledge Mr. Everard's approach, his face bore that combination of excitement and anxiety which marks the young when they find themselves privy to adult concerns they do not fully comprehend. Young Timothy, it had transpired, had been present in the church vestry earlier that morning when Reverend Hale had been visited by Mrs. Prudence Ashworth, a widow of stern aspect and sterner principles, whose opinions on matters both temporal and spiritual were delivered with the force of divine proclamation. The boy had not, he assured Mr. Everard with an earnestness that suggested considerable inner conflict between honesty and discretion intended to overhear their conversation. He had merely been arranging hymn books in the adjoining room, but voices, when elevated by emotion, have a tendency to carry, and Mrs. Ashworth's voice, even in its more moderate registers, could penetrate oak and stone with remarkable efficacy. What Timothy had heard rendered in that fragmentary fashion which characterises accidental eavesdropping painted a picture both intriguing and incomplete. There had been mention of that winter, spoken with a significance that required no further specification. There had been references to promises made and circumstances beyond control. There had been, most strikingly, a phrase which Timothy repeated with careful precision, as though unsure of its meaning but certain of its importance. We did what seemed merciful at the time. Mr. Everard listened with that quality of attention which neither encourages tale-bearing nor discourages genuine communication. He asked no probing questions, offered no interpretations, but simply allowed the boy to unburden himself of information which clearly weighed upon his conscience. When Timothy had finished, Mr. Everard thanked him gravely for his diligence in the church's service and suggested, with gentle firmness, that matters of adult concern were often more complex than they appeared, and that discretion was a virtue which served both the bearer and the subject of sensitive information. The boy nodded, visibly relieved to have shared his burden, while simultaneously reminded of his obligation to respect the confidences he had inadvertently acquired. He returned to his sweeping with renewed purpose, and Mr. Everard entered the church, where the cool dimness and the scent of old wood and candle wax provided a welcome respite from the complications of human affairs. Inside, he found Miss Brown engaged in arranging greenery along the window-sills, her movements precise but distracted, as though her hands worked independently of her thoughts. She started slightly at his approach, then composed herself with that particular effort which reveals more than casual ease ever could. For several moments they worked in companionable silence, Mr. Everard assisting with the heavier branches of holly, whilst Miss Brown attended to the more delicate placement of ivy and mistletoe. It was she who spoke first, her voice carrying that quality of confession which sometimes emerges when the burden of private reflection becomes too great to bear alone. She spoke not of the note directly, but rather of the charitable committee she had once helped to organise, some 12 or 13 winters past. It had been, she said, a time of particular hardship, when the harvest had failed and winter had come early and stayed late, and when the usual resources of the community had been stretched to their limits. There had been a family, she recalled, whose circumstances had been especially dire, a husband injured and unable to work, a wife in poor health, and children too young to be of material assistance. The committee had met repeatedly to discuss how best to help them. There had been genuine concern, genuine desire to act. But there had also been complications, considerations of fairness to others equally in need, questions about the long-term wisdom of various forms of assistance. And while these matters were debated with the best of intentions, winter had deepened, and the family's situation had grown more desperate. Miss Brown's voice faltered as she spoke of what had followed. The family had applied to the parish for more direct assistance. The matter had been referred to various authorities. Forms had been filled out, procedures had been followed, but somewhere in this machinery of organised charity, between intention and action, between promise and fulfilment, something essential had been lost. The family had departed Cranleague Hollow in the spring, quietly and without ceremony, leaving behind unpaid debts and unanswered questions. The town, Miss Brown admitted with a candour that cost her visible effort, had been relieved by their departure. It had simplified matters, removed an embarrassment, allowed everyone to return to their comfortable conviction that they were, on the whole, good people who did their duty towards their neighbours. The family was occasionally mentioned in prayers, remembered vaguely as unfortunate souls who had met with bad luck. But their names, their specific faces, their particular story had been allowed to fade from collective memory. Until now, it seemed. Until Christmas morning and a note passed from hand to hand, reminding the town of what it had chosen to forget. Mr. Everard received this confession, for such it was, with the same quiet steadiness he brought to all things. He did not offer absolution, for that was not his to give. He did not minimise the difficulty of decisions made under the pressure of competing needs and limited resources, but neither did he dismiss the burden Miss Brown carried, the weight of a kindness delayed until it ceased to be kindness at all. When they parted, the church was adorned for Christmas, beautiful in its simplicity, ready to receive those who had come seeking comfort and meaning in ancient rituals. But Mr. Everard, stepping back into the pale sunlight, understood that the town's true preparation for this sacred day had only just begun. Chapter 2. The note passed hand to hand. The peculiar quality of a secret which is shared among many is that it ceases, in one sense, to be a secret at all, whilst in another sense it becomes more profoundly secretive than any confidence kept by a solitary heart. For when knowledge passes between persons without being openly acknowledged, it acquires a weight and substance quite different from that which attaches to ordinary information. It becomes, as it were, a presence in the room, an invisible guest at every gathering, shaping conversations by its very absence from them. So it was in Cranleigh Hollow on that Christmas morning. The note, though seen by perhaps no more than a dozen souls, had somehow made its influence felt throughout the town in that mysterious fashion by which such things travel. Not through gossip precisely, for the matter was far too delicate for the usual channels of rumour. Rather, it spread through glances and pauses, through conversations that veered suddenly into safer waters, through an unusual attentiveness to the weather and other topics of guaranteed neutrality. Mr. Thomas Everard, whose professional duties had long accustomed him to the handling of communications both trivial and momentous, found himself observing these signs with the practised eye of one who reads meaning in margins. As he made his rounds that morning, delivering those few items of post which could not wait even for Christmas Day, he noted with particular interest the manner in which various households received him. At the home of Mr. Leonard Hayes, a gentleman of prosperous circumstances whose standing in the town had risen considerably over the past decade, the door was answered with unusual promptness. Mr. Hayes himself appeared, rather than sending his housekeeper, and his greeting, though cordial, possessed that quality of studied casualness which often indicates a mind very much occupied with matters it wishes to appear to have forgotten. He accepted the single letter Mr. Everard had brought with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, inquired after the postmaster's health with excessive particularity, and then, with what seemed almost relief, closed the door more quickly than courtesy strictly required. Miss Eliza Brown, who resided in a neat cottage at the edge of the village green, presented a contrast of different sort. Where Mr. Hayes had been too quick, too bright, too insistent upon normalcy, Miss Brown was subdued to the point of withdrawal. She was a woman of middle years whose life had been devoted to charitable works, organising relief for the poor, arranging visits to the sick, and generally concerning herself with the welfare of those whom fortune had treated less kindly than herself. Yet this morning, when Mr. Everard appeared at her gate, she seemed almost reluctant to emerge from her doorway, and their exchange, brief though it was, left him with the distinct impression that she wished very much to say something whilst being equally determined not to do so. It was at the home of Mrs. Cole, however, that the morning's peculiarities reached their fullest expression. That good lady, having completed her holly-gathering expedition, had returned to her dwelling and was engaged in the preparation of a goose of such magnificent proportions that it seemed to require her entire attention, along with a running commentary of such exhaustive detail that Mr. Everard found himself learning more about the selection, preparation, and anticipated cooking time of this particular bird than he had ever imagined possible or desirable to know. Mrs. Cole spoke of the goose as though it were a matter of national importance. She discoursed upon the superiority of geese fattened upon the common over those raised in more confined circumstances. She expatiated upon the merits of various stuffing preparations. She offered observations delivered with the confidence of settled conviction regarding the precise temperature at which perfection might be achieved in the roasting process. And all the while her hands moved with a nervous energy quite at odds with the placid content of her speech, and arranging and rearranging sprigs of rosemary, adjusting the position of the roasting pan, and generally manifesting that particular species of agitation which seeks to disguise itself through the performance of domestic duty. Mr. Everard listened with his customary patience, offering those small sounds of acknowledgment which social convention requires whilst contributing nothing of substance to the discourse. He had learned over many years of quiet observation that persons in a state of inner disturbance often reveal more through what they avoid saying than through what they say, and that the kindest service one can render them is simply to be present, neither probing nor pretending ignorance, but merely offering the steady companionship of one who will not judge whatever confession, if any, they may eventually choose to make. When at last Mrs. Cole's monologue wound to its natural conclusion, she stood for a moment in silence, her hands at last still upon the edge of the table. Then, with an attempt at brightness that fooled neither of them, she inquired whether Mr. Everard had encountered any interesting developments in his morning's rounds. It was, he understood, both a genuine question and a test, an attempt to discover what he knew without revealing what she knew, a conversational gambit of the sort which arises naturally in situations where information is valued precisely because it is uncertain. His response was crafted with care. He mentioned the beauty of the morning, the satisfaction of seeing the town in its Christmas attire, the pleasure of delivering greetings along with letters. He spoke of small kindnesses observed, of children excited by the prospect of putting in gifts, of the general air of goodwill, which, despite certain undercurrents he did not name, genuinely pervaded Cranley Hollow. And in speaking thus he both acknowledged and declined to acknowledge the true substance of her inquiry, maintaining that delicate balance which his position required. As he departed Mrs. Cole's residence and continued his circuit through the town, Mr. Everard reflected upon the curious nature of the task which seemed to have been assigned to him, though by whom and for what ultimate purpose he could not yet discern. For it had become clear, through the accumulated evidence of the morning's encounters, that he was expected to play some role in whatever drama was unfolding. People looked at him with a certain expectancy. They weighed their words in his presence with unusual care. They seemed to be waiting for something, though whether for explanation, reassurance, or absolution he could not determine. The truth, which he had learned long ago through experiences both painful and instructive, was that the life of a town like Cranley Hollow depended upon a complex web of understood but unspoken agreements. Certain things were known but not discussed. Certain events were remembered but not recalled. Certain questions were pondered privately but never posed publicly. And these silences, far from being mere absences, were active forces which shape the community's character as surely as its more visible institutions and traditions. The note, whatever its precise contents and whoever its author, had disturbed this equilibrium. It had brought into the light of conscious acknowledgement something which had long rested in the comfortable shadows of collective forgetfulness. And now the town, like a person awakened suddenly from sleep, was attempting to orient itself, to decide whether to face fully what had been revealed, or to turn over, as it were, and return to its slumber. Mr. Everard, walking the familiar lanes with his familiar measured tread, understood that his role in this moment was not to force a decision, but simply to be present as the town made its choice. He would offer no accusations, press for no confessions, demand no reckonings. He would simply continue, as he had always done, to perform his duties with care, to treat all persons with kindness, and to remember in his own quiet way what others had chosen to forget. For he knew, better than most, the cost of being the sole keeper of inconvenient truths,